Abigail. Have you ever heard of that name? 1 Samuel 25 will tell you all about it. Thanks for coming by Discovery class. Get comfortable, relax, and join in. What were your parents like when you were growing up? Do you remember them being affectionate? Did they kiss, hold hands? Did your dad open the door for Mom? What about your household economics? Did they discuss money together? Was your dad a good provider? Who was it that did all the disciplining? I'm the product of a brother and a sister and parents that came through the Depression back in the 1930s. And because of that, my parents were very frugal. I was taught right from wrong because they were strict disciplinarians. I was never in want. Everything we had was homemade: meals, gardening, canning, windfall apples, vegetables, meat. Education was a big thing to my mom and dad, even though Dad only went to grade 5. He wanted me to do better. In other words, in that little household, I felt wanted, I felt loved, and I certainly was accepted. What happens when you find yourself in a relationship that isn't what I just described? Well, that's my lesson today. It's about a couple who were complete mismatches. And because they were a mismatch, their relationship ended in disaster. But the story has a beautiful silver lining. So don't go away, you better hear it. Have you ever heard of a couple being sweet and sour? Well, this is them. 1 Samuel, in the Old Testament of our Bible, gives us a story of this couple. Here are their names. He was called Nabal, and his wife was Abigail. And the Bible doesn't give us a lot of detail about their beginnings, but it gives us enough. Nabal, he was fabulously wealthy, a lot of money. He lived in a huge estate in Syria on the border with Israel. He was a Calebite by tribe, and he owned field after field of sheep, just like a huge, massive ranch. He'd be known in the Middle East today, I suppose, as an oligarch. Abigail, his wife, she was a Jew, and she was known for her beauty. She was stunning, very attractive, but also very wise. She commanded a huge household, and she managed Nabal's books. Nabal and Abigail, they lived in the town of Maon, and they owned the land in the district of Carmel, with hundreds of sheep and goats. And the story in our book is going to unfold during the time of the sheep shearing. In Israelite culture, the wool trade was probably the most desired natural resource in the country. I live in Alberta. Our natural resource is fossil fuel, oil and gas. If you are our neighbors over to the east from Saskatchewan, your natural resources would be potash and agriculture. In our Bible narrative, David is not king yet. He's gathered around him, though, a mighty band of warriors. And he's been fleeing from King Saul, who is out to kill him because he's jealous of him. David is hiding in the wilderness of Paran, which is next to Nabal's sheep pastures. Samuel the high priest has just died, but before he passed away, he chose David to be his anointed new king of Israel. And from his camp near Nabal's herds, David sends 10 of his young men with a message to Nabal, the affluent landowner. It was simply a warm shalom, a greeting. And it was a greeting of goodwill from all of David's men. It was very simple. Here's what it said. Long life to you. Good health to all your servants. That's pretty humble. And all that belongs to you and yours. Doesn't get better than that. This kind of salutation was very common during the sheep shearing because it was Israel's version of Thanksgiving. It was a time of festival. It was a time of gift giving. It was a time of thanking Yahweh for the abundant harvest that he had bestowed on his people. And the wealthy gentry, of whom Nabal was part, when they feasted during this time of the shearing, they would throw huge parties for their staff. And that was very, very common. So, in 1 Samuel 25, verse 5, David simply asked Nabal if he would give a thanksgiving gift of food to David and his men during this festive period. David's men, remember, they were hiding in Nabal's very neighborhood, and he wasn't harming any of his servants. He didn't bother them in the sheep shearing. He just kind of kept an eye on things. The men were probably his security guards. Well, Nabal, hearing this, he responded with defiance. I don't know any David, he said. Who is this son of Jesse? What's he doing in these parts, camping out in secret? Why should I take my bread and my meat and my wine that I've sacrificed for, and I'm going to give to my servants, and I'm going to hand it off to him? Who does he think I am? I don't even know this guy. He's a stranger. Well, in those days, it was a matter of routine politeness simply to dispatch a cordial reply, even to a man's deadliest enemy, during the festival time, kind of as a peace offering. Bury the hatchet. We're going to get along. It's party time. No, that's not Nabal. Can't you see what's coming? When these 10 men come back to the camp and they tell David, now I want you to remember, David is a fighting man. He's a giant killer, fully armed. You and I would probably call him a lethal weapon. When news of Nabal's scorn reaches David, here's what he does. He says to his men and makes a command. Men, put on your swords. 1 Samuel 25:13. He orders 400 men to start marching towards Nabal's palace. He's going to keep another 200 soldiers back in the camp to keep an eye on things. You can sense that there's going to be a slaughter coming, and it's not going to be sheep. One of Nabal's shepherds, probably a trusted family confidant on the inside, considering Nabal was so abrasive and he was so rude towards David, do you know what he does? He goes to his wife Abigail and warns her that there's an impending danger coming. And that impending danger is going to be very, very rotten. Nabal's wife, she's a very smart cookie. She can think on her feet. She has heard of David's legendary military status. She probably heard about David and Goliath. She also knows that David and his men did not harm, they didn't steal any of Nabal's sheep while they were camped nearby. So she also knew that her husband, he had kind of a fly-off-the-handle personality, volatile, quick-tempered, short-fused. When he didn't have all these facts, he had just insulted the new future king of Israel. Abigail knows her husband very well. That's not unusual for a partner that lives in a sweet and sour marriage. What does she do? Well, she has to make a decision, and she's got to make it quite fast. She takes action right now. She's going to prevent bloodshed, and she's going to prevent disaster if it works. And she does it without her husband's advice, nor does she do it without even his consent. This is going to be a very risky decision. A woman's status in the Middle East is not the same as yours. Men ruled. Women obeyed. There's a stern protocol for a woman if she defied her husband. And the consequences of that action would be brutal, and it would be punishing, and it would even be death. She knew by her decision that she's going to make that her life is going to be changed dramatically. And it wouldn't be positive. A decision like the one that she's about to make is what constitutes the character of martyrs. That's what martyrs do. That's what this lady's going to do. She didn't care. She was going to do what was right. Well, let's get to it. What does she do? She sets out to rescue that fatal decision made by her stupid husband, Nabal. She could have kept quiet. She could have let her husband die. But this woman was exceptional. I can't tell you over the years as a pastor, in my ministry, as I've watched all those Abigails in the congregation, in their marriages, do acts of courage, acts of selflessness, just like Abigail's in 1 Samuel 25. The husband didn't deserve it, but she came to his rescue. And it solved a multitude of sins, and their courage often of these ladies and their energy directed towards helping the very man that would have been so easy to despise is almost beyond understanding. You know what I'm talking about. You're one of them. Well, without telling a soul, Abigail goes to her kitchen, and she orders all her household staff to gather around. I want you to hear something, all of you. And she tells them, I need your help. And I want it right now. Close down everything you're doing. Together, we're going to prepare a royal feast. But I want you to work secretly. Don't tell anybody what we're doing. And we're going to feed 600 hungry men. And the meal will not be eaten here in the palace. It's not going to be here that we're going to serve it. This is all going to be takeout food, loaded on our donkeys, and it's going to be delivered off these premises. And they'll be delivered to King David's camp in the wilderness of Paran. Now, I'm going to make this up. I'm talking about 200 roasted lambs, 100 dozen pita bread, 35 pounds of butter, 400 pounds of rice, 25 gallons of gravy, 200 pies, 100 fruitcakes, 300 gallons of wine, and all transported on a fleet of donkeys, without your husband even knowing what's going on. Abigail did that and led all those laden donkeys out of her yard, and she meets David almost at the palace, marching with his 400 men en route to kill. If the attack took place, can you imagine the carnage? Not one man in Nabal's household would be left standing. Women would be widows. Children would be orphans. Anybody left would be homeless. A complete bloodbath. The streets and houses would flow with blood. David looks up and sees this woman coming with all these donkeys and all her staff, and stops in his tracks and stops his men from marching. He sees Abigail and the donkeys laden with feast, coming towards him, and he opens his mouth and he utters these words, Thank you, God, for intervening through this woman, Abigail. Then come these words, 1 Samuel 25, verse 32. Praise be to the Lord, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment, and for avenging myself from my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord God of Israel, who keeps me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would be left alive by daybreak. Do you suppose Jesus had Abigail in mind when he delivered the Sermon on the Mount? Matthew 5:9, Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons and daughters of God. Matthew Henry, he was a British clergyman 400 years ago. Brilliant young student. When he was only 10 years of age, he could read and write Latin and Greek. He wrote the famous commentaries on the Bible. The Matthew Henry commentaries, they were called. I got one. And he made many wonderful quotes about life and danger and sacrifice and Christian behavior. Here's what he said. Extraordinary afflictions are not always the punishment of extraordinary sins, but the trial of extraordinary graces, sanctified afflictions, and spiritual promotions are in the hands of somebody like Abigail. Do you see how Abigail's actions promoted her? Abigail made peace with David and his mighty men. How is she now going to make peace with her husband Nabal, who will kill her because she went behind his back? Well, when she gets back home, after she's fed David and they've had their party, she finds him partying with his friends, feasting, eating, drinking, and he's intoxicated. She's smart. She's not going to bother him. She's going to let him sleep it off. She wisely waits for her husband to sober up. She'll tell him in the morning, since obviously he was oblivious to the peril that was right at his doorstep. The Bible can say a great deal, class, in just 2 or 3 words. Amazing, isn't it? The next morning, Abigail tells Nabal what she did. He probably had a head-splitting headache from his hangover. And Abigail tells Nabal her meeting with David. These are the last words that she ever spoke to him. Do you know what happened? 1 Samuel 25, verse 38. The Lord struck Nabal, and he died on the spot. Probably had a heart attack. There's a verse in the Proverbs that describes this, I think. Proverbs 15:25. The Lord pulls down the proud man's house, but he keeps the widow's boundaries intact. I told you at the outset that this lesson has a lovely silver lining. Shortly after Nabal's death, David, back there in the camp, he gets wind of what happens to Nabal, or Abigail's husband. Do you know what he does? He pays Abigail a personal visit, knocks on her door, and there in the living room they chat, talk. He's going to reward her and thank her for what he did saving all the lives of Nabal's family. Do you know how he paid her back? He'd probably get down on one knee and he asked her to marry him. She's a widow. And you know what she said? Yes, I will marry you. You're going to be King David. I'm going to be your wife. Abigail, the fool's widow, became the king's wife. Faithfulness and obedience was rewarded. Wives, those of you that are listening to me, living with a horrible Nabal, your marriage has been sweet and sour. How did you handle it? And how are you handling it? Be Abigail. Keep your heart full of kindness. God will take your side. And He's got a lot of answers for you. He wants you to be patient. He wants you to wait. And He wants you to tell Him what's on your heart. He won't let your husband get away with what he's doing, you know. Just lay bare your heart and watch what happens. It was the day before Mother's Day in 1919 in northern France. And a young Canadian soldier was missing his mom. So he did what boys back in 1919 did. He wrote her a letter. He wanted to lay bare his heart down there in the trenches of northern France. And it was a letter that would melt the heart of any mother if she received it. Especially one whose son is fighting in a war way across the ocean, knowing she may never see him again. The soldier's name was Carl Howe, spelled the same as Gordie Howe. Wonder if they were related. Here's what he wrote. How I would like to step in and surprise you, Mother, tomorrow on Mother's Day. Not an hour of this day goes by, but what I think of you. And the thoughts of you, and the much good advice you have always given me, has always been a bright star for me to follow, even down here in the trenches. And I shall always have those little visions. And nothing in the world can dim that bright guiding light. That it's become that for me. I'm a little shy of expressing emotions, and I normally don't write such a letter. However, in a Mother's Day letter, I think such thoughts should be expressed in words, and words that are heart to heart. The most love ever. And God bless you, Mom. The dearest little mother in all the world, Carl. Wouldn't you like to have a letter sent to you like that if you're a mom? Well, that's my lesson of Abigail. Isn't that an amazing story? Do you think that's happening today in our generation? Sure, it's happening all the time. What do you do about it? Just like Abigail. Be patient, be faithful, and watch. During the summer, we've been looking at personalities in the Bible. That's one. There's more coming. I hope you'll come back and hear them. Thanks for joining me today.